I want you to take a second and just, well, look around at the absolute pillars of your modern life.
Yeah, the things we just completely take for granted every single day.
Exactly. I'm talking about the invisible architecture you interact with literally all the time, probably without even realizing it.
Right.
Like the social safety net that catches us when we lose a job.
Or even just the 8-hour workday that dictates the rhythm of your entire week.
Yes. Or the constant quiet hum of global trade bringing you your morning coffee from Brazil, or, the microchips in the device you're listening to right now.
And hovering in the deep background of all of that, the ever-present threat of weapons of mass destruction.
Right, which is wild to think about. We tend to look at all of this and just assume it's the natural evolution of society.
Like it's just the steady, inevitable march of human progress.
Exactly. But what if almost every single one of these foundational elements wasn't a natural evolution at all?
What if they were forged in the fires of an unprecedented 31-year global catastrophe?
Which is such a crazy thought. It really alters your entire perspective when you step back and observe the origins of our current reality.
It really does. I mean, we are navigating a world that was completely rewired by trauma.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Rewired by trauma.
If you look closely at the institutions we rely on, they aren't the products of peaceful consensus.
No, not at all.
They're basically emergency flood walls constructed during a period when human civilization almost completely washed itself away.
And that is exactly the journey we are taking you on today in this deep dive.
We are unpacking a sweeping historical analysis of what is often called the short 20th century.
Right, which is the period from 1914 to 1991. Our mission today is to fundamentally understand how the breakdown of the 19th century world order completely rebuilt human civilization.
Through total war, radical revolution, and catastrophic economic collapse.
Yeah, from the ground up, we're going to explore how that collapse shattered everything that came before it.
And why the world you live in today is essentially the ruins of that explosion, just hastily reassembled.
It's fascinating. But to genuinely grasp the magnitude of that shattering, we have to establish the baseline first, right?
We do. We have to understand the world as it existed before the summer of 1914.
Because the shock of the 20th century only makes sense if you understand the incredible, almost hubristic confidence of the 19th century.
Exactly. I mean, if you were a European living in that era, particularly in the middle or upper classes, your reality was defined by an absolute belief in unbroken progress.
Both moral and material progress, right?
Oh, absolutely. There had not been a major continent-wide war involving all the great powers for a full century.
Which is just staggering, not since the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815.
100 years of relative peace.
It's almost hard to wrap my head around that level of optimism.
I know, it really is.
Like if you read the literature of the time, someone like Jane Austen, who was writing right through the Napoleonic Wars,
right, yeah,
you would barely know a global conflict was happening.
Because the wars of the 19th century were just so distant from the daily lives of most citizens.
They were fought by small, professional armies, or they were colonial skirmishes fought thousands of miles away.
And that distance was entirely intentional. I mean, 19th century wars were essentially limited engagements with highly specific objectives.
Like what do you mean by specific objectives?
Well, they functioned almost like gentlemen's duels between nations.
Okay.
A conflict might break out over a disputed border, or maybe a specific colonial possession.
Right, so the armies would maneuver, a decisive battle would be fought, a treaty would be signed, and a province might change hands.
Exactly. Even the bloodiest conflicts in Europe during that century, like the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, resulted in military casualties of around 150,000.
Which is a terrible tragedy, obviously, but fundamentally a localized one.
Right. The major powers, Britain, France, Russia, Austria-Hungary, Prussia, they simply did not cross into each other's core territories with the intent to wage absolute destruction.
They just didn't do it. The prevailing belief was that Western civilization had intellectually and morally evolved past the barbarism of total annihilation.
They really thought they had solved the problem of human savagery.
And then the lamps went out.
They did indeed. Edward Grey, the British Foreign Secretary, he stood at his window watching the streetlights of Whitehall being extinguished.
This was on the night Britain and Germany went to war in August 1914, right?
Yes. And he remarked, "The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime."
Wow. It gives you chills.
It was a profound realization that the illusions of the 19th century were dead.
Because the war that started in 1914 didn't just break a century of peace. It broke the very concept of limits in human conflict.
Which introduces this whole concept of the 31 Years' War.
Right, this continuous agonizing period of global conflict and massive social crisis stretching from 1914 straight through to 1945.
I mean, I want to spend some time on this idea of a 31 Years' War because the sheer scale of the carnage defies human comprehension.
It really does. The top 4 deadliest conflicts in the entire recorded history of our species all occurred in the 20th century.
Across this 31-year period, we are talking about roughly 187 million megadeaths.
187 million.
Yeah.
I really want you, the listener, to try and visualize that number.
It's almost impossible.
187 million people is roughly 10% of the entire global population in the year 1900.
1 in 10 human beings wiped out by human decision.
It's horrific.
Numbers of that magnitude quickly become abstract, they just lose their emotional weight.
Yeah, it just becomes a statistic.
Exactly. To ground it in lived reality, consider this haunting observation recorded in Sarajevo in 1946.
So just after the Second World War ended.
Right. An observer walked through the streets and noticed they were filled with young women whose hair was completely starkly gray.
Oh, wow.
Their faces and bodies showed they were in their 20s, but the psychological terror and physical deprivation of the war had literally drained the youth from their hair.
That is so incredibly sad.
He noted that nothing could speak more clearly to future generations about the nature of this era than those youthful gray heads.
Because it wasn't just soldiers dying in trenches. It was the psychological and physical devastation of entire populations on a cellular level.
Exactly.
So the obvious question here is, well, what fundamentally changed?
Right. How do you go from a century where war is a limited, localized duel to an era of systematic massacre?
Yeah, what was the underlying mechanism that shifted?
Well, the underlying mechanism of the conflict completely changed. As we established, 19th century wars had limited, specifiable objectives.
You fought for a piece of territory and then you went back to trading with each other.
But the First and Second World Wars were waged for entirely unlimited ends.
Unlimited ends.
The objective was no longer about slightly adjusting the balance of power on a map. International political rivalry had fully fused with capitalist economic competition.
Okay, let's unpack that.
So Germany didn't just want to defeat Britain. Germany wanted Britain's global supremacy.
Ah, I see.
It had to relegate Britain to a permanently inferior status to secure its own economic future.
And conversely, Britain and France were fighting for their very survival as great independent powers.
Right. It ceased to be a negotiation and became a zero-sum game.
Let me see if I can translate this into a modern context.
Yeah.
Think of 19th century wars, like 2 massive tech companies suing each other over a specific patent.
Right, you want to win the lawsuit, you want the financial payout.
Exactly. Maybe you want exclusive rights to a specific feature, but you don't want to destroy the entire tech industry.
You both still want the global market to exist tomorrow so you can sell your products.
Right. 20th century war, however, was a monopoly battle.
Yes.
The goal wasn't to win a legal settlement. The goal was to literally burn down your competitors' server farms.
Salt the earth around their headquarters.
Yeah, and ensure their executives could never, ever rebuild. You want an absolute, total elimination of the competition.
That is precisely the structural shift. For the belligerent nations, survival dictated that the sky had to be the limit.
And because the ultimate goals were limitless, the means used to achieve them naturally became limitless too, right?
Exactly. We see the horrific physical manifestation of this logic on the Western Front of the First World War.
With the trenches.
Millions of men dug into a complex network of trenches, stretching continuously from the English Channel down to the Swiss frontier.
Facing what was famously described as hurricanes of steel.
Yes. We are talking about days and sometimes weeks of unceasing industrialized artillery bombardment.
It's hard to even imagine the noise.
The strategic goal wasn't a clever flanking maneuver. The goal was to simply pulverize the enemy's physical environment.
And their human bodies.
Until there was nothing left. And then send waves of infantry over the top into heavy machine gun fire to claim a few yards of cratered mud.
I mean, the logistics of that destruction are terrifying.
Yeah.
Just the Battle of Verdun alone involved 2 million men.
2 million.
And resulted in 1 million casualties.
It's unfathomable.
And then you have the British offensive on the Somme. The entire purpose of the Somme was just to relieve the pressure on the French at Verdun.
Right.
The British lost 60,000 men on the very first day of that battle.
60,000 dead in a few hours.
It was essentially a factory machine designed for massacre.
And the demographic impact is staggering. Britain lost 500,000 men under the age of 30.
A full quarter of all Oxford and Cambridge students who served were killed.
France suffered even worse. They lost almost 20% of their entire demographic of men of military age.
Wow. If you were a French soldier, you had a 1 in 3 chance of coming out of the war without a physical injury.
Just brutal. And this is where the cause and effect of unlimited war becomes so crucial to understand.
How so?
Because it was fought for limitless ends, and because the blood sacrifice was so astronomical, no government could possibly accept a compromise peace.
Right. How do you tell your population that 1 million men died for a negotiated draw?
You can't. The war had to be fought until one side reached total systemic exhaustion.
And when that exhaustion finally shattered the German and Austro-Hungarian empires in 1918, the victorious powers faced a massive dilemma.
Britain, France, and the United States. They imposed a peace settlement, the Treaty of Versailles, that was structurally designed to fail.
It was a doomed attempt to permanently enfeeble Germany while completely ignoring the underlying reality of how the global economy functioned.
Exactly.
Right. They slapped Germany with this infamous war guilt clause, blaming them entirely for the conflict.
And demanded astronomical financial reparations.
But everyone at the negotiating table, deep down, knew the numbers were a fantasy, didn't they?
Oh, absolutely. The brilliant economist John Maynard Keynes was actually at the Paris Peace Conference, and he desperately warned them.
What did he say?
He essentially said, look, Europe is an integrated economic machine.
Right.
If you don't reintegrate Germany, the largest industrial engine in the center of the continent, into the European economy,
if you try to keep them permanently crushed and bankrupt,
there will be no financial stability for anyone. You will drag us all down.
But the political reality overrode economic sanity.
It did. The victors, particularly France, who had borne the brunt of the physical devastation on their own soil, were pathologically terrified of a German economic and military recovery.
So they radically redrew the map of Europe.
They carved up the fallen Russian, Austro-Hungarian, and Ottoman empires into a patchwork of new, small nation-states.
Ostensibly based on the ideal of ethnic self-determination, right?
Yes, but practically, these new borders trapped countless ethnic minorities on the wrong sides of lines,
creating massive, deeply entrenched political instability.
Furthermore, they completely alienated the newly formed Soviet Russia, treating it as an international pariah state while simultaneously trying to keep Germany on its knees.
It's like trying to build a stable table while intentionally sawing off the 2 thickest legs.
That's a perfect analogy.
You cannot have a peaceful, functional European continent when the 2 largest and most populous powers in the region, Germany and Russia, are actively excluded from the international system.
It practically guaranteed that this 31 years war was going to have a catastrophic second round.
Which leads us directly into the logistical paradox of the era.
Yes.
If you are a nation engaged in a war where the explicit goal is total destruction,
and you are losing millions of young men to machine gun fire and disease,
how does this society not simply disintegrate? How do you keep the munitions factories running?
How do you ensure the civilian population doesn't starve to death in revolt?
I genuinely want to know the mechanics of this. In the 19th century, if a war broke out, the baker kept baking bread, the tailor kept making suits, and the free market just kind of chugged along.
Right.
But you can't run a world war on the free market, can you?
You absolutely cannot. The fundamental truth discovered during this era is that a society does collapse under the weight of total war unless the state aggressively steps in.
Steps in and does what?
Seizes absolute control over the mechanics of daily life. The First World War gave birth to the modern planned war economy.
So they had to abandon the whole 19th century capitalist ideal of business as usual.
Exactly. To sustain the unimaginably hungry meat grinder of the front lines, governments had to physically commandeer the allocation of raw materials.
Because market forces just couldn't build artillery shells fast enough.
The state had to dictate exactly what factories produce, who was allowed to work in them, and what specific caloric intake the civilian population was permitted to consume.
War evolved into the largest, most complex organizational enterprise hitherto known to humanity,
requiring conscious, meticulous, top-down bureaucratic management.
And here is a detail that completely subverts what we might assume.
Yeah.
You would logically think that an authoritarian, militaristic, rigidly bureaucratic state like Imperial Germany would be perfectly suited to execute a planned war economy.
Right, they love order and discipline, right?
Exactly. But the reality was the exact opposite.
It is a fascinating and crucial paradox.
The democratic Western powers, Britain and France, were actually far superior at managing their planned war economies than the authoritarian Germans.
The mechanism of the German war economy was ultimately chaotic, disjointed, and profoundly inequitable.
While the British system, however, realized that total war requires total social cohesion.
They structured their planned economy around the principle of equality of sacrifice.
They implemented strict national rationing systems and social welfare policies designed to ensure everyone, regardless of class, shared the burden.
Remarkably, the poorest demographics of British civilians were actually slightly better fed and enjoyed better baseline health by the end of the Second World War than they did before it began.
Wait, really?
Yes, simply because the state was finally ensuring a minimum caloric floor for everyone, even as overall national consumption plummeted.
Wow. So the democratic accountability actually made their war machine more resilient.
Exactly. Meanwhile, the German system was just a brutal hierarchy.
It relied heavily on stripping resources from occupied territories and utilizing horrific levels of brutalized foreign slave labor.
By 1944, forced foreign labor made up a full fifth of the entire German workforce and up to 30% in their crucial armaments industry.
It was an inherently fragile, violently inequitable system that prioritized maximum military output at the total expense of human life.
Particularly the lives of anyone not deemed ethnically German.
And the sheer volume of material this bureaucratic machine had to produce is mind-boggling.
Oh, it's unbelievable.
We aren't talking about ordering a few thousand muskets anymore. During the Second World War, the U.S. Army alone ordered over 519 million pairs of socks.
Wait, I'm sorry, 519 million? That is just insane.
Right, 519 million. And the German military, being the ultimate paper-pushing bureaucrats, even while losing the war, ordered 4.4 million pairs of scissors and 6.2 million ink pads for military stamps in a single year.
The scale shifted from artisanal conflict to planetary mass production.
This industrialization of conflict fundamentally transformed the psychological contract between the state and the citizen, didn't it?
It did. Because total war requires the total mobilization of the entire civilian populace.
Women in the factories, men in the trenches, children collecting scrap metal.
It became a true people's war. But to convince millions of normal people to endure such profound horrors and deprivations for years on end, the enemy has to be absolutely demonized.
Right. In those aristocratic wars of the 19th century, there was often a sense of shared chivalry, a professional respect between opposing officers.
But in a total democratic war, you have to utilize mass propaganda to convince your population that the other side is literally subhuman.
If they are human, the slaughter is a tragedy. If they are monsters, the slaughter is a moral necessity.
Exactly.
Wait, I want to push back on that specific point, or at least challenge the premise.
Okay, go ahead.
When we look at the incredible barbarism of the 20th century, the deliberate firebombing of civilian cities, the systematic extermination camps, is that cruelty truly a result of this ideological demonization? Or is it actually a result of the new remote technologies?
It's a great question.
Think about it. If you are a mild-mannered, normal young man working in a bank, you might physically gag and vomit at the thought of running a bayonet through a terrified civilian.
The visceral intimacy of the violence stops you.
Right. But if you put that same young man 3,000 feet in the air, and his only job is to look at a dial and push a button to drop a payload of bombs on a city grid, he can't even see.
The victims are invisible.
Exactly. The violence is remote. The technology shields him from the barbarism.
That is a critical debate, and the reality is that the two forces, ideology and technology, acted as a devastating feedback loop.
So it's both.
It is inextricably both. The technology absolutely provided the physical distance, but the ideological mobilization of total war is what fundamentally broke the moral compass of the societies wielding that technology.
Wow.
One of the most profound observations of this era is that the greatest cruelties of the 20th century were not acts of passionate, intimate hatred.
They were what? Administrative?
Yes, they were the impersonal, administrative cruelties of remote decision-making, of system, and of routine.
So the ideology allowed them to build a system, and the technology allowed them to operate it without feeling guilty.
Precisely. Total war normalized the idea that human lives are merely logistical data points.
This administrative detachment allowed completely normal, hard-working, family-oriented bureaucrats to sit at comfortable desks in Berlin and meticulously calculate railway timetables for cattle cars going to extermination camps.
They felt no personal, visceral involvement in the murder because their specific job was merely optimizing transport efficiency.
That is chilling.
Yeah.
The technology of distance, whether that distance is created by the altitude of an airplane or the compartmentalization of a bureaucratic flowchart, allowed humanity to normalize concepts that were previously unthinkable.
Concepts like the systematic, calculated bombing of civilian populations.
Which, by the end of the Second World War, had become an entirely normalized military tactic accepted by all sides.
Or the invention of stateless people.
Suddenly, for the first time in modern history, millions of refugees had no bureaucratic existence.
They had been violently expelled from empires that literally no longer existed on the map.
The League of Nations actually had to invent something called the Nansen Passport, a recognized document for people who belong to nowhere.
And of course, the sheer scale of the administrative violence forced the invention of a brand new word.
Genocide.
Starting with the 1.5 million Armenians murdered by the Ottoman Empire during the First World War, and culminating in the industrial slaughter of the Holocaust.
It's just so heavy. And while this era normalized unimaginable horrors, if we are to understand the full scope of how it rewired society, we must also impartially observe its other systemic consequences.
Right, because the necessity of total mass mobilization fundamentally and permanently altered the social fabric of the globe.
Because the men were dying in the trenches, it brought women permanently into the industrial workforce.
Accelerating social shifts that might have otherwise taken decades.
It also accelerated technological development at a breakneck, unprecedented speed.
Fields like aeronautics, early computer science, and nuclear physics leapt forward.
Because governments fighting for their survival were suddenly willing to pour infinite resources into development costs that no private capitalist enterprise would ever risk in peacetime.
Exactly. But the psychological toll of all this?
I want you to really imagine being a working-class citizen in 1916.
You realize that your aristocratic elites, the kings, the czars, the politicians in their top hats,
have confidently and arrogantly led your entire generation into a meaningless industrialized meat grinder.
The trauma and the betrayal felt by millions of people created a massive pile of social explosives just waiting across the globe.
By 1917, the pressure inside this global boiler was so immense that something had to give.
All it needed was a spark.
And that spark predictably landed in the weakest link of all the European empires.
It landed squarely in Tsarist Russia.
By early 1917, the logistical and emotional strain of total war finally shattered the Romanov Empire.
And what is vital to understand about this moment, a moment that would dictate global politics for the next 70 years, is that it didn't begin with a grand, sophisticated Marxist blueprint being perfectly executed by ideological masterminds.
No, it began with pure, visceral, desperate exhaustion.
I am obsessed with this specific historical detail.
The spark that brought down a 300-year-old autocratic dynasty wasn't a dense political manifesto.
It was working-class women taking to the freezing streets of Petrograd on March 8th, which happened to be International Women's Day.
They were just demanding bread because their children were starving.
They were quickly joined by male workers who had been locked out of the massive Putilov metalworks factory.
The Tsar's regime didn't collapse because it was ideologically outmaneuvered.
It collapsed because the troops, the famously loyal, brutal Cossacks, were finally just too tired, too cold, and too sympathetic to shoot starving mothers.
They refused orders. They mutinied.
And in 4 chaotic, largely leaderless days, the entire imperial structure simply vanished.
Just evaporated. And the evaporation of that massive autocracy left an immediate, terrifying power vacuum.
On one side, you had a fragile, liberal provisional government operating out of the palaces,
desperately trying to keep Russia fighting in the First World War to appease their Western allies, Britain and France.
On the other side, down in the streets and the factories, you had the grassroots Soviets.
Spontaneous, localized councils of workers and mutant soldiers who held the actual physical power in the cities, but had no overarching national direction.
And into this chaotic, polarized vacuum stepped Vladimir Lenin and his faction, the Bolsheviks.
And Lenin's genius in this moment wasn't his strict adherence to Marxist purity.
It was the exact opposite.
He led by knowing exactly how to follow the crowd.
He looked at the chaos of Petrograd and realized a fundamental truth.
The freezing, starving masses didn't care about the nuances of socialist theory.
The urban poor wanted bread immediately.
The soldiers in the trenches wanted peace immediately.
And the peasant farmers, who made up 80% of the entire Russian population, wanted to own their own land.
So Lenin bypassed the dense political theory and offered an incredibly simple, ruthlessly effective slogan.
Bread, peace, land.
Which brings us to the great defining paradox of the October Revolution.
According to orthodox Marxist theory, a true socialist revolution was supposed to happen in the most advanced, highly industrialized capitalist nations.
Places like Germany, Britain, or perhaps the United States.
Marx believed you needed a massive, educated, organized urban proletariat working in highly developed factories to transition to socialism.
But Russia was the antithesis of this.
It was a deeply backward, largely agrarian, illiterate peasant country.
According to the textbook of their own ideology, it was the absolute last place a Marxist revolution was supposed to succeed.
Even the majority of Russian Marxists at the time believed they were only supposed to be helping achieve a bourgeois liberal democracy, not jumping straight to a socialist state.
Wait, let me stop you there.
Okay.
Because this genuinely confuses me.
Okay, what's confusing?
If Lenin was a devout Marxist, and Marx explicitly said this only works in rich, industrialized countries, why on earth did Lenin push for a total socialist takeover in a country of poor peasant farmers?
That's the paradox.
Was he just ignoring the very theory he claimed to worship? It makes zero sense to force a revolution in a country that lacks the economic foundation for it.
It is a brilliant question, and understanding Lenin's logic here unlocks the entire strategy of the early Soviet state.
Okay, lay it on me.
Lenin wasn't ignoring Marx. He was making an astronomical existential gamble.
What kind of gamble?
Lenin's strategy was built on the deep conviction that a socialist revolution in backward Russia would not and could not survive on its own.
So he didn't plan on doing it alone.
Right. He viewed Russia merely as the detonator.
He believed that if the Bolsheviks lit the spark in Petrograd and declared a worker state, the sheer audacity of it would trigger a massive, global proletarian revolution.
He was specifically looking at the advanced industrialized nations like Germany, whose populations were equally exhausted and radicalized by the meat grinder of the First World War.
So the Russian Revolution was never meant to be an isolated national event.
No, it was explicitly designed to be the first domino in an immediate worldwide uprising.
And here's the craziest part. For a brief, terrifying moment, it really looked like Lenin's insane gamble was going to pay off.
The shockwaves from Petrograd were truly planetary.
The message of the workers overthrowing the elites resonated everywhere.
You had Mexican muralists painting massive frescoes of Lenin alongside indigenous Aztec figures.
You had Cuban tobacco workers on plantations forming their own local Soviets in solidarity.
You even had tough Catholic Irish sheep shearers way out in the Australian outback raising a glass and cheering for the Russian workers' state.
The psychological impact was just, well, it was global.
And within Europe itself, the old aristocratic order was actively crumbling.
By the end of 1918, the ruling monarchies of Germany, Austria, Hungary, Turkey, and Bulgaria had all collapsed.
The dominoes were falling. Left-wing uprisings were breaking out.
A brief Soviet republic was actually declared in Bavaria.
And another took power in Hungary.
The Bolsheviks, riding this wave of momentum, formed the Communist International, the Comintern, headquartered in Moscow.
Its explicit stated purpose was to coordinate, fund, and direct this global uprising.
They genuinely, fervently believed that the world revolution was not just possible, but imminent within months.
But the reality of holding power forces you to make deals with the devil.
Right. To survive long enough to even see this hypothetical world revolution, Lenin had to completely abandon his socialist dogma overnight.
When he seized power, the peasants were already taking over the estates of the nobility.
Lenin instantly issued a decree giving the peasants official individual land rights.
He basically said, yes, go ahead, divide the great estates into private, family-owned farms.
Now, wait a minute. Giving millions of people private property is the exact opposite of the socialist ideal of collectivized, state-owned agriculture.
It's essentially creating millions of tiny capitalists.
Exactly.
It was a massive ideological contradiction, but it highlights Lenin's supreme pragmatism.
He knew the demographic math.
If he tried to force 80% of the population, heavily armed peasants, into collectivized farms in 1917,
they would have turned against the Bolsheviks instantly, and the revolution would have been crushed by conservative forces within a week.
He sacrificed Marxist agricultural theory to secure the political survival of the regime.
And it barely survived. They fought a brutally destructive, multi-year civil war
Fended off interventions from foreign armies.
and navigated total economic collapse.
But Lenin's grand detonator gamble ultimately failed.
The global revolution didn't happen.
The communist uprisings in Germany and Hungary were violently crushed by right-wing paramilitaries and the state.
The Soviet Red Army tried to push into Europe, but was decisively stopped at the gates of Warsaw in 1920.
By 1921, the dust had settled, and the undeniable truth emerged.
The revolution was not going to sweep through the industrialized West.
The capitalist states, traumatized as they were, had stabilized.
This left the Bolsheviks in a completely unprecedented and terrifying geopolitical position.
You now have this massive, economically backward, physically ruined country, Soviet Russia, sitting there as an isolated communist island in a hostile global capitalist ocean.
They were completely cut off.
For the international revolutionary movement to survive this isolation, its entire strategy and structure had to radically mutate.
It had to shift its focus away from the industrialized, urban factory workers of Western Europe, which had been Marx's original central vision.
And it had to look for entirely new, unconventional battlegrounds.
And to facilitate this mutation, to manage a revolution that was suddenly playing the long game, the Comintern in Moscow formalized a very specific, rigid organizational structure.
The Vanguard Party model.
Lenin insisted that the international communist movement shouldn't just be a loose democratic coalition of sympathetic left-wing thinkers.
It needed to be a hardened elite core of professional, highly disciplined revolutionaries.
It demanded absolute, unquestioning loyalty to the central command hierarchy in Moscow.
To understand how the Vanguard model operated, it is helpful to step away from the concept of a traditional political party.
What do you mean? Like, how did it function then?
It functioned far more like a universal church or a highly disciplined monastic order.
A monastic order. That's an intense comparison.
Well, it required a level of absolute personal devotion where an individual would dedicate their entire life, their safety, and their identity to the cause.
Wow, okay.
These professional revolutionaries would change countries and identities more often than their shoes, moving wherever Moscow directed them.
To organize strikes, infiltrate unions, or foment rebellions.
This elite, centralized discipline was incredibly effective at keeping the movement alive during the lean years.
It allowed tiny, highly committed groups of individuals to punch way above their weight and exert disproportionate influence in various countries.
But as the prospect of a traditional urban worker revolution in Europe faded into fantasy, the actual tactics of revolution had to evolve.
The focus shifted away from the classic 1917 model.
Which was basically armed crowds storming government buildings in the capital city.
Right, and moved toward prolonged, decentralized, rural guerrilla warfare.
We see this monumental strategic shift pioneered most effectively in China by Mao Zedong.
After the Chinese communists were brutally massacred by their nationalist allies in the urban centers like Shanghai in 1927, Mao recognized a structural reality about China that mirrored Russia's backwardness.
He realized that the true revolutionary engine in China lay not in the tiny, easily suppressed urban proletariat,
but in the massive, deeply impoverished and historically rebellious peasantry.
He retreated his forces deep into the remote mountains and began building rural, self-sufficient Soviet zones.
And how he did this is fascinating. Mao wasn't just copy-pasting Marx.
He was adapting the ideology to the cultural reality of the people he was trying to lead.
He drew deep inspiration not just from European political theory, but from traditional Chinese folklore and tales of social bandits.
Specifically, the classic novel, The Water Margin.
He blended Marxist rhetoric with the ancient, culturally resonant idea of righteous outlaws fighting corrupt officials on behalf of the peasants.
He fundamentally adapted the revolution to an agrarian society, utilizing a strategy of slowly surrounding and strangling the cities from the countryside.
Yet this strategic evolution reveals a persistent tension within the revolutionary model.
You have this vanguard party, an elite, highly educated, fiercely disciplined central committee,
attempting to carefully orchestrate a revolution from the top down.
But true social revolutions are not orchestral performances.
They are volcanic eruptions from below.
When the authority of a state actually evaporates, the masses often act on their own raw, unvarnished impulses.
And those impulses frequently do not align with the vanguard's sophisticated long-term master plan.
The perfect example of this disconnect is the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s.
When the right-wing military rebelled in 1936, the authority of the Spanish Republic collapsed in many regions.
And the working-class masses rose up to defend it.
But they didn't just read Marxist pamphlets and orderly collectivize the shoe factories.
They engaged in massive, spontaneous, incredibly visceral anti-clerical violence.
They murdered thousands of Catholic priests and monks.
They burned churches.
In a single diocese in Catalonia, over 6,000 religious statues and images were dragged into the streets and destroyed.
And crucially, the official communist leadership in Spain and Moscow actively opposed this violence.
They denounced it.
From a strategic standpoint, murdering priests alienated moderate allies and handed a massive propaganda victory to the fascists.
But the vanguard could not control it.
For the impoverished, exploited Spanish peasants and workers, the church was the most visible, immediate symbol of their historical oppression.
To the masses, this iconoclasm, physically destroying the symbols of the old hierarchy, was what a revolution truly felt like, regardless of what the party directives from Moscow dictated.
It's the friction between the blueprint and the reality.
But despite these massive internal contradictions, the vanguard model proved to be incredibly durable.
It laid the groundwork so that when the resistance movements against Nazi occupation during the Second World War created new, vast power vacuums across Europe and Asia,
these highly disciplined communist cadres were perfectly positioned to step in and take control.
While the political map of the world was radically fracturing into these competing capitalist and communist spheres, and revolutionaries were honing their tactics in the mountains of China, the foundational economic engine that fueled the entire pre-war capitalist world was quietly, systemically rotting from the inside.
We generally have a very specific cultural memory of the 1920s.
We think of the Roaring '20s.
Right. We picture flappers dancing the Charleston, underground jazz clubs, and stock markets booming so high that everyone thought they were going to be rich forever.
But when you actually dive into the structural economics of the decade, a terrifyingly different picture emerges.
The massive world war that caused those political vacuums in the East also caused hidden catastrophic structural imbalances in the West.
The prosperity of the Roaring '20s was, in profound ways, an illusion constructed on an incredibly fragile foundation.
And that foundation gave way completely and spectacularly in the fall of 1929.
The Wall Street crash didn't just hurt investors, it triggered an economic abyss unlike anything the capitalist world had ever experienced.
The Great Slump, as it's often termed, was a genuinely global earthquake.
But to understand why it was so severe, we have to look closely at the mechanical flaws that the First World War introduced into the global financial system.
Okay, let's trace the mechanics of this rot. The most massive change was that the First World War completely flipped the center of gravity in the global economy.
Before 1914, Great Britain was the undisputed financial engine of the world.
But the war bankrupted Britain.
By the 1920s, the United States had emerged as the world's biggest creditor nation. Everyone owed them money.
And the undisputed largest industrial producer. By 1929, the U.S. was producing a staggering 42% of the world's total industrial output.
The structural problem arose from how the United States chose to manage that newfound supremacy.
Before the war, Britain had acted as a global stabilizer.
Because Britain is a relatively small island, its economy deeply, fundamentally needed the rest of the world.
It relied heavily on international trade to feed its population, and it exported capital globally to develop foreign markets.
Because of this interdependence, the Bank of England actively managed the international payment system to keep it functioning smoothly.
If a crisis hit, Britain intervened to ensure global trade kept flowing.
But the U.S. didn't do that.
No, because the United States was, and is, a massive resource-rich continent.
It was largely economically self-sufficient. It didn't strictly need the rest of the world economy to survive in the way Britain did.
Consequently, it simply didn't bother to adopt the responsibility of acting as a global stabilizer.
The U.S. was the premier exporting nation in the world and the second largest importer.
This meant that when the U.S. economy contracted, its massive gravitational pull dragged the entire global market down with it.
But because the U.S. lacked the institutional will and the economic necessity to stabilize the system, there was no safety net when the fall began.
I want to try an analogy here to explain what was happening inside the U.S. economy during the 1920s.
Yeah, I love your analogies. Let's hear it.
Think of the 1920s boom, not as a solid building, but as a massive, towering skyscraper where the entire foundation is made of credit cards.
Okay, credit card foundation.
On the outside, with the stock market soaring and new factories opening, the building looks incredibly tall and prosperous.
But the foundation is structurally doomed.
Exactly. The industrial boom in the 20s was fueled by mass production. churning out millions of cars, radios, and appliances.
To buy all this stuff, the middle and working classes were pushed into massive consumer debt.
They were buying on installment plans. But, and this is the fatal flaw, while corporate profits and executive wealth were skyrocketing, the actual real wages for the working class were largely stagnant.
Exactly. You have a system producing an ever-increasing volume of goods, but the masses who are supposed to buy those goods don't have the actual income to sustain the consumption.
Right. The profits are pooling at the very top of the skyscraper, but the people at the bottom don't have the cash to keep the engine running.
So they use more credit cards to prop up the foundation.
When the psychological confidence finally broke in 1929, the credit vanished.
The foundation didn't just crack, it pulverized.
And because the U.S. economy was the gravitational center of the world, when that credit card skyscraper collapsed, it brought the entire global economic highway down with it.
The subsequent collapse in global demand was catastrophic and immediate.
U.S. imports and exports both crashed by roughly half in a very short period.
And because the United States was the primary consumer of the world's raw materials, the sudden evaporation of American demand sent the prices for primary commodities into an absolute freefall.
Things like wheat, cotton, sugar, coffee, and silk.
The global price of tea and wheat plummeted by 2/3.
I want you to picture the sheer, absurd tragedy of what this looked like on the ground.
The global market became completely disconnected from human need.
On one side of the globe, in South America, you had Brazilian farmers desperately shoveling absolute mountains of perfectly good coffee beans into the fireboxes of steam train engines.
They were literally burning food to artificially reduce the global supply, hoping to prop the prices back up just enough to survive.
A crisis of artificial overproduction.
Yes. Burning coffee while people starved.
Because at the exact same time across the Atlantic in heavily industrialized Germany, unemployment hit an apocalyptic 44%.
I really want the listener to sit with that number.
Imagine walking down your street or looking around your office and realizing that nearly half of all the working adults you know suddenly have no job.
No income and no social safety net to fall back on. The despair was total.
In Germany, at one point during the slump, a staggering 85% of the members of the rapidly growing German Communist Party were completely jobless.
You have millions of people who cannot feed their families, watching the capitalist system seemingly choose to burn food rather than distribute it.
It was an environment of profound radicalization.
The sheer terror of this economic abyss forced the remaining capitalist democracies into a genuine existential crisis.
The populations of Europe and the Americas were realizing that the system was fundamentally broken.
If governments didn't adapt, and adapt immediately, the desperate masses would inevitably turn to the extreme autocratic alternatives that seemed to confidently offer solutions.
The extreme left of Soviet communism or the violent militaristic extreme right of fascism.
And this sheer terror brings us to the death of 19th century economic liberalism.
Before the Great Slump, the absolute, unquestioned gospel of capitalism was free trade, the strict adherence to the gold standard, and the core belief that governments must keep their hands completely out of the economy.
The prevailing wisdom was that the market is a natural organism.
If it gets sick, you just have to let it suffer through the fever until it naturally corrects itself.
But the Great Slump killed that ideology stone dead.
It had to die because the fever was threatening to kill the patient entirely.
The vicious deflationary cycle of the slump meant that every individual nation panicked and desperately tried to protect its own domestic industries at the expense of everyone else.
The grand ideal of global free trade was abruptly abandoned as nations threw up massive retaliatory tariff barriers.
Even Great Britain, the very birthplace and spiritual home of free trade since the 1840s, officially abandoned the policy in 1931 and retreated into a protected imperial economic bloc.
And they ditched the gold standard, too. I want to make sure we explain why ditching the gold standard was so crucial.
As I understand it, the gold standard basically tied a country's currency directly to the physical amount of gold sitting in its vaults.
Correct. It acted as a financial straitjacket, which was great for ensuring stability in the peaceful 19th century, but disastrous during a crisis.
If your economy is collapsing and thousands of factories are closing, a government might want to print more money to stimulate the economy or provide relief.
But under the gold standard, you legally cannot print more money unless you physically acquire more gold.
So if your economy is bleeding out, you can't just print financial bandages.
You are legally forced to sit there and watch the economy die because you don't have enough shiny metal in a basement.
Precisely. It prevented governments from fighting the deflationary spiral. The pressure became unbearable.
The gold standard, which was seen as the untouchable bedrock of international monetary civilization, was systematically ditched.
Britain dropped it, the Scandinavian countries dropped it, the United States under FDR dropped it, and eventually even the stubborn French dropped it.
The threat of total societal collapse forced politicians to realize a hard truth.
You can no longer prioritize theoretical free market economics over physical social stability.
If the people are starving, and they are joining radical communist militias or fascist paramilitary groups in the streets, your precious free market is going to be burned to the ground anyway.
This terrified realization is what birthed the modern welfare state and the widespread adoption of Keynesian economics.
John Maynard Keynes and a new generation of economists forcefully argued that the old logic was wrong.
In a deep depression, the market will not naturally correct itself because demand has completely evaporated.
Therefore, they argued, the state must aggressively intervene.
It must step in as the spender of last resort.
The government must artificially stimulate demand by creating massive public works programs.
Essentially, borrowing money to hire the unemployed, knowing that those workers will then spend their wages at local businesses, which will then hire more people, creating a positive multiplier effect.
The state had to actively ensure full employment and provide a baseline safety net.
This is where we see the creation of things like the U.S. Social Security Act of 1935, or unemployment insurance.
They weren't just being generous, they were building firewalls to prevent the kind of mass, hopeless desperation that leads directly to political explosions.
Social considerations and political survival were suddenly permanently elevated above pure laissez-faire economic theory.
And we must observe the ultimate profound irony of this entire historical moment.
While the democratic capitalist world was drowning in mass unemployment, breadlines, and burning coffee, the Soviet Union was undergoing Stalin's brutal, ruthless 5-year plans for forced, rapid industrialization.
Right. To a journalist or an intellectual sitting in London or New York in 1932, watching their own society seemingly disintegrate, the USSR appeared completely, almost magically immune to the Great Depression.
While Western factories rusted and closed, Soviet industrial production was literally tripling.
There were no unemployed people in Moscow because the state drafted everyone into the industrial army.
We must be fiercely impartial and clear-eyed in our assessment here, that Soviet industrialization was achieved at an unimaginably horrific human cost.
It required mass political repression, the execution of dissidents, the brutal forced collectivization of agriculture, and engineered famines that killed millions of Ukrainian and Russian peasants.
It was a society built on terror.
However, from the perspective of a panicked, desperate Western world in the early 1930s looking for any solution to their own economic collapse, the Soviet system seemed to be the only macroeconomy on Earth that was actually functioning and growing.
And that perception changed everything. It made the concept of economic planning a global obsession.
Suddenly, leaving the economy to the invisible hand of the market seemed suicidal.
The idea that a central government should actively plan and direct the economic future inspired everyone.
It inspired moderate, democratic bureaucrats in Britain drafting post-war consensus papers.
It heavily inspired Franklin D. Roosevelt's brain trust, designing the New Deal in the United States.
And crucially, it heavily inspired fascist dictators.
Hitler's regime actively implemented state-planned economic policies, even calling it the 4-year plan, directly mirroring the Soviet terminology to prepare Germany for war.
Planning became the universal religion of the mid-20th century.
So we arrive at the synthesis of this chaotic era.
The fear of global communism spreading to desperate populations, combined with the visceral structural trauma of the Great Depression, literally forced capitalism to save itself from its own excesses.
Capitalism essentially had to learn to compromise to avoid being overthrown entirely.
It adopted vast social safety nets, it accepted heavy state regulation and intervention, and it completely abandoned the ruthless, dogmatic purity of the 19th century free market just to survive the 1930s.
When we talked at the very beginning of this deep dive about the world you and I live in today, the unemployment checks, the Social Security, the managed interest rates by central banks.
All of those structures are the direct, lingering result of a capitalist system that was utterly terrified for its own survival.
That is the essential historical through line we must recognize.
The unprecedented industrialized carnage of the 31 Years' War shattered the old empires, destroyed the old aristocratic certainties, and proved that progress was not guaranteed.
That massive physical and psychological trauma birthed the radical, desperate alternative of Soviet communism in the East.
Simultaneously, the financial maneuvers used to fight that war created a hidden structural rot within the global capitalist economy.
That rot inevitably triggered the Great Depression, which in turn forced the creation of the modern interventionist welfare state.
Every major geopolitical and economic structure of the late 20th century was built in reaction to these compounding disasters.
It is a staggering chain of cause and effect.
And it leaves humanity in a profoundly altered state of existence.
As we wrap up this deep dive into the short 20th century, I want to leave you, the listener, with one final, deeply haunting thought.
One of the most striking conclusions drawn from analyzing this era is that the 20th century was the very first time in human history that the organic, lived link between generations was fundamentally snapped.
Think about the scale of human history.
For roughly 7,000 years, ever since the invention of basic agriculture in the Stone Age, the overwhelming, vast majority of humanity lived in essentially the same way.
By growing food on small plots of land, herding animals, and living subject to the rhythms of the seasons.
The technological and social realities of a peasant in 1800 were not unfathomably different from a peasant in 1200.
But that 7,000-year epoch of human continuity permanently ended in the crucible of the short 20th century.
Mass urbanization, the industrialization of agriculture, and the explosion of technology severed us from the land.
We are now living in what is essentially a permanent present.
We are completely disconnected from the lived daily experience of our ancestors.
The traditions, the rhythms, the old maps and charts of human behavior that guided families for millennia.
All of it was completely burned away by the trauma, the mass mobilization, and the technological inferno we've explored today.
We have entered a new phase of human existence, navigating a highly complex, globally integrated, technologically terrifying world, largely without a historical compass.
Which brings us right back to where we started our conversation today.
The next time you look around at the pillars of your modern life,
when you check your retirement account, when you look at a globe, or when you read a headline about global supply chains,
remember that these systems are not the natural, peaceful progression of history.
They are the emergency structures we desperately, hastily built out of the rubble in the muddy, blood-soaked waters of a century that almost completely destroyed itself.
If the old maps have burned, what guides us now as we face the entirely new crises of the 21st century?
It's something to think about as you go about your day.